for everyone, but he's a science teacher with specialisation in physics. He graduated with a bachelor's degree of education in science and physics from the University of Malta, and these areas of expertise include the science education, curriculum assessment, practical working skills and professional development. And today he's going to be talking to us about the effectiveness of physics lab reports and practical tests as assessment schools of practical skills. So thank you again. I will put reminders in the chat when we get to 5 minutes and 1 minute to the time, but I'll shut up now and leave you to start. Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity. Good morning, everyone. So the research is about the effectiveness of physics lab reports and practical tests as assessment tools of practical skills. So this presentation is going to the introduction, the methodology used, the analysis of results, and the findings and conclusions. To start off with, the majority of schools and institutions in Malta prepare their students to sit for examinations set by MATSEC, which is the national examination body in Malta, with reference to the practical work in the science subjects. I'm talking about at SEC level. This is assessed by a series of written lab reports. These reports are completed by the students after their practical activity and corrected by their school teacher. The marks awarded by the school teacher are then reviewed by external moderators who represent MATSEC, and eventually the mark is included in the global mark of the assessment. So this culture of mass-producing lab reports led me as a researcher to reflect, and through such reflection, I ended up with several questions which I wasn't able to answer. Some questions include: why is this needed? Does it include student competencies concerning practical skills? Can students be asked questions of practical nature in the written paper and eliminate this percentage of practical work? Does this mean that this method of producing reports is the ideal method to assess the students' practical skills? So the first step which I did is to refer to the literature, and needless to say, there is a lot of literature about practical work. So whilst reading the literature, I felt the need to elaborate further on my previous questions and focused on one aim of practical work, that is to learn and enhance practical skills. Without underestimating the importance of the other aims of practical work, through this research and for the sake of the research questions, it is being assumed that practical work is done to learn and enhance practical skills. So the following two research questions were outlined. Two practical sessions followed by the assessment of written lab reports give suitable feedback on the student practical skills. And will practical tests instead of the assessment of written lab reports give more reliable information about students' learning? Throughout this research, 36 students, participants took part in this research. So once the research questions were outlined, I encountered another difficulty in the methodology to be used. So the traditional methods, which are very often used, would be interviews, questionnaires, and focus groups. So I don't want to underestimate the reliability and validity of such methods, but it was evident that such methods were not suitable for my research questions. What questions shall I ask? And these questions will lead to what? A reliable and valid assessment of students' practical skills or their perceptions. So I had to go back to the literature to try and find the most suitable method to be used for my research questions. And what I did is that I designed a practical activity which was set for the participants, and it was the same for all the participants irrespective of their year group. The practical activity was based on theory and concepts which were covered in the first year, in year 9, so that all participants were exposed to these concepts at some point in their course. All participants were unfamiliar with the case study presented in this activity. So eventually, I video recorded the students doing this practical activity And whilst video recording the students, I asked them to use as well the think aloud method. So the video recording allowed me as a researcher to review the observation multiple times, and the think aloud method allowed me as a researcher to uh, trace the practical skills of the students in their verbal communication. Moreover, the video recorded aspect of this research allowed me as well to elicit the non-verbal communication of the students whilst doing the practical work. Using the think aloud method was not easy because students were not familiar with this approach, considering they are year 9 and year 10 students. So I had to invest more time to allow the participants to become familiar with this method prior taking part in the data collection. Once all the students participated in this research, I ended up with 36 long videos, which I needed to use to extract the data. So the question was, what is the best way to maximize the potential use of this data? The table was used for each participant and for each video recording, which is at the bottom of the slide. So each video was viewed 4 times, each time inputting a specific column. This process was repeated after several weeks to promote reliability. So, in a nutshell, the data collection was based mainly on 3 sections, which was the verbal communication from the think aloud method and the audio recording, the non-verbal communication achieved through the video recording, and the written communication, since the documents produced by the participants were collected after the practical activity. Some of the results. So one of the activities which the students were given was to find the density of water, giving 500 ml of water in a beaker and several apparatus. Interestingly enough, it was clear that the first student, for example, is unaware of the true concept of density. However, an accurate result was still obtained and reported by the end of the experiment. Moreover, the other student, who evidently is very proficient in the concept of density, achieved and recorded a good result as well. So if someone had to correct the lab report of these 2 students, he or she would not be able to outline the difficulty of the first student. If we were doing practical work to practice the procedures or to recall what has been said in class, then this would be more or less correct. However, practical work goes beyond recalling procedures, so the aim of assessing students' practical skills would have definitely been not achieved by means of a written lab report in this case. The main concern is that the final answer of both participants were almost identical and it was very close to the true value. Another instance is where a candidate, a student, since the volume of water and fuel was the same, the participant expected their mass as well to be the same. Eventually, the student ignored this line of thought and ended up with correct results. But should the written lab report only be reviewed, one would not be aware of this misunderstanding from the candidate side. So, apologies for the overlapping of the shapes, but basically, by no means am I saying that reliance on recall is something which a student should not do. However, there should be the balance should be struck between the reliance on recall and the other higher order skills. Another important issue which was evident in this research was honesty, because honesty among students during the practical work is very hard to analyze by means of write-up only. At the end of the day, useful feedback would not be attained if the student is not honest in his work or in her work, and thus the student's weaknesses would not be identified. Um, there were instances in this research where students were observed to tamper with the results so that they achieve a good grade for the lab report. So the distinction between different forms of analysis would have been impossible to outline through the student's written lab report only. The fact that students were observed carrying out their analysis enabled the researcher to identify to what extent the analysis was conducted, and to acquire feedback on the students' level of analytic skills as well. So these are the summary of the primary results. The so-called successful students who achieve good grades in their written lab report may still lack the practical skills and might only be comparing values and recalling facts. By reviewing their written work only, it would be very difficult to assess the competency in the practical skills. Through the practical exam and test, some students demonstrated their high proficiency in analysis during the unexpected occurrences during the practical exam. Through this feedback from the practical exam, the teacher would be able to re-evaluate the teaching pedagogy, whereas this would have never been achieved through the assessment of lab reports only. There are also some secondary findings which I'm not going to go into during this presentation because of the time limit, but feel free to browse through them on my online presentation. So, evidence from this research is showing that the practical tests as an assessment tool provides better feedback about practical skills. However, integrating these practical tests within the current assessment system may seem time-consuming. So it is being recommended that educators have a form for each student, which is the same form for each student used throughout the 3-year course. The teacher can conduct practical tests in various topics along the course where students are required to use practical skills and keep the same form. It would be impossible to assess each student on each skill during the same session, so the teacher can organize practical tests according to what has been assessed and has yet to be observed. Should students fail to demonstrate a skill in one test, the teacher would plan sessions where students need to practice practical skills, and other tests, practical tests, where students can demonstrate these skills. So the students will then be given the opportunity to work on their weaknesses and improve their learning, rather than giving them a grade for the written report and submit it to MedSec for their final grade only. The skill of writing a report and using technical vocabulary makes up a very small proportion of these skills. So the frequency of written lab reports should be reviewed, whilst exploring alternative methods of assessment such as practical tests. So, to conclude, practical tests should not replace the assessment of lab reports. Rather, they should complement them for more reliable information about the students' practical skills. The frequency of written lab reports should be re-evaluated and adapted according to the students' needs by the teacher themselves, rather than imposed by an external examination body such as MedSec. Better assessment of practical skills will lead to a better opportunity for both the students and teachers to identify and work on the weaknesses, which is the primary function of assessment. So that would be my conclusion. If you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat or ask them.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Roderick. That was a very interesting talk. It actually covered some of the same ground I'm going to be talking about in my talk later, so that was really interesting to hear about. So I can see a couple of people already typing in the chat, so let's have some questions. So Dominic has quite a long question there, or a comment. I would have answered the initial question differently. We assess lab report writing since the ability to write reports will be an important skill, whereas the science, which only gives the subject, might not. Students will most likely not need to measure the density of water, but will need to write reports. So what would be your response to that, Robert?
That's very true. That's very true. However, I was mainly interested in the skill which we say that it is being taught and enhanced and assessed, but actually we're not. So my point of view was the final grade, is it really what it means, or there's something else behind it? But that's a very good insight as well, and definitely it's very interesting to investigate in further research.
I think the key question is the one you asked, which is, what is the purpose of any given assessment? So anyway, so Geetika also has a question. If teachers are responsible for assessing practical skills, are they actually trained on it to have fair results?
They are trained but the thing is that when you have when you have written lab reports that are contributing to a high stake in the national exam, the culture is that the students and the teachers, together with the parents of the students, are more concerned about the grade and how they will do in the grade. So the drive behind the motive behind the experiment is no longer the skill learned through the practical activity, but rather it is about the marks to gain so that I will have a good grade in my final assessment from the national examination body. So I believe that the teachers are well trained, but it is not up to the teacher only. It is also the approach by the students, because at the end of the day, the students are doing the work. The teacher is just supervising the students.
Okay, so thank you very much, Roderick. Does anybody else have any additional questions? I think we've got one minute left. If not, we'll go on to our next speaker. It doesn't look like I have any more questions. So thank you very much, Roderick, for your talk. That's excellent. And if we could now go on to our next speaker, who is Shotaro Naganuma.